Okay, so today we're going to discuss the bargaining model of war. This is going to be the foundation of what we're going to be talking about for most of this week, with the idea being that this is a formal theoretical way of trying to explain the puzzle of why countries will fight each other. And again, remember from the last talk, this is a strange evolutionary behavior where humans that we would think of would want to perpetuate the species engage in conflict that might destroy the species, might undermine the species. Now, we know from history that wars are fought for political reasons. Wars are not just gang fights, wars are not just fights for release. They're typically thought of as conflicts that fought for political reasons. And what we're going to focus on this week are political conflicts that are fought between states. Again, empirically, what we know is that since the end of World War II, the United States has used military force more than any other country. So we're going to theoretically examine it in this lecture, which is just generally, why do we see two countries fight each other? And then you can apply that and think about that to answer the question why the United States is going to fight and why other countries might be willing to fight the United States. Now, what I can say is that if we look at the empirical data, the U.S. is the one initiating conflict more. It's not other countries attacking the United States, so that certainly has happened. Japan being an example of that. And if you want to consider the attacks of 9/11 being an example of that, you can, though that's a little bit different because that's a conflict between a terrorist group and the United States. What we're focusing on today is really just conflicts between states and other states, so strictly interstate conflict. So we want to answer the question, why do we see war between states? Why do we see conflicts like World War I, World War II, the Gulf War, etc.? So let's focus on that, and I will pull up the screen so we can lecture. So we're going to be talking about this question in a somewhat abstract theoretical way to start, just so we can get an explanation for why we see war. And then I'll give some empirical examples as to how we get to war towards the end when we go over some cases. So one way to think about war, I think, first of all, is to think of this as we have to have at least two states. One state can't fight a war against itself. So it has to be a dyadic phenomenon. And when we typically think about this, we think about war as being a strategic process. Both states, right, there has to be at least two, and both states have to make the decision to enter into conflict. So it has to be a strategic choice. So we want to talk about how is it that we get to the point where we see countries entering into this phenomenon of war. So where war is typically thought of is a product of bargaining failure. Von Clausewitz said this very famously, that war is a product of bargaining failure. That idea has been around in most studies of war, that wars are not just done for fun, for release, etc. Right? Wars are not just done on a whim, that they typically are done to achieve some political aim. And that political aim can be conceptualized as bargaining. So if war is fought over territory, there is bargaining over a territory that fails, that the two parties fail to reach an agreement, and as a result of this end up in war. There might be negotiation over a regime and whether or not it can stay in power. In that case, there's negotiation that may or may not end up in war. In order to understand war, what we can't do, though, is to focus on just the cases where we observe war. That is only focusing on the cases where we actually see the phenomenon. And if we do that, we can't understand why we got to that phenomenon. We have to be able to understand, why do we see war under certain circumstances, and why do we fail to see war under other circumstances, right? So in order to understand war, we can't just focus on the big cases like World War I or World War II or the Gulf War or the Korean War or Vietnam, etc. We have to look at the cases where we have near misses. Right, so we want to understand, why did we see war in 1939 but fail to see war in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? We want to be able to understand war and the failure to get to war in the same sort of theoretical framework. So again, the theoretical framework that's proposed by Jim Fearon, amongst several others, Jim Fearon was just the one that formalized it, was to try to think of war as a bargaining problem. So let's think of it that way. Let's think about a type of negotiation that you're probably fairly familiar with. Let's think about negotiating for a car. Now, there are websites today where you can buy cars and you don't have to haggle. But if you think about how negotiation for cars used to be, right, and how they still are, if you choose to do it this way, the way it would work is you would go to a dealership. You would then be met by a representative of the dealership, and you would look at a car. If you like the car, you would want to buy that car, right? So that's something that you gain from is actually taking possession of the car. The dealer would also want you to buy the car because then they get commission on a sale. So if you think about it that way, both you and the dealer want the same thing, right? You want to purchase the car, the dealer wants to sell you a car. Now, this is an important thing to think about in the bargaining problem. Both you and the dealer want the same thing. Getting an agreement is something that is in both of your interests. It's positive sum, right? The difference is you prefer to pay less for the car and the dealer prefers for you to pay more for the car. The dealer is going to want you to pay the maximum amount possible, whereas you're going to want to pay the least amount of price possible. What that's telling you is that both of you want the same thing, both of you disagree over the terms of negotiation. That's the bargaining problem. That's how you want to think about this. So let's think about it as negotiation over um, any major issue or any major territory, right? So if we think about the negotiation over the status of Berlin during the Cold War, for those of you that don't know, West Berlin is surrounded by East Germany, right? During the time of the Cold War, West Berlin was essentially encircled by a communist state, East Germany, but West Berlin remained an outpost of West Germany in that circle. Now, the US and the Soviet Union had a disagreement over what the status of West Berlin should be. The United States wanted to keep West Berlin completely under the control of West Germany, whereas the Soviet Union wanted to absorb West Berlin completely under its own control. Both sides wanted peace, right? Both sides did not want to fight, but both sides disagreed on what the terms of peace looked like. For the United States, the terms of peace was maintaining the status quo and keeping West Berlin as a part of West Germany. For the Soviet Union, the terms of peace should be that because Berlin was in the territory of East Germany, it should be under East German control. So both sides want the same thing. They want peace. They disagree on what peace looks like. And as similar to this situation where they're negotiating over a car, both sides are going to try to convince each other that they're right. Both sides are going to try to push each other. Both sides are going to try to convince each other to get to the terms of a deal that are better for them. So if you think about negotiating for a car, what a customer typically will do, or what I typically do when I've been in a situation, is I'll misrepresent, right? I'll tell a dealer I'm only willing to pay, say, $2,000 when I may be willing to pay 10. And for a dealer's perspective, they're going to tell me that they can't go below $8,000 when in reality they might be able to go to 5. Now, I prefer the deal at $5,000 to $8,000, but the dealer is going to try to lie and cheat and try to make me uncomfortable and try to waste my time. So I eventually agree to a deal that's preferable to her. On the other side, I'm going to lie and cheat so the dealer eventually agrees to a deal that I prefer. I'm going to say, I can't possibly pay this much. I'm going to say that I'm going to walk out and get another deal. I'm going to try to pull every dirty trick in the book to try to make sure that the deal looks better to me. Both of us want the same thing. Both of us disagree on what the terms look like. From the US and the Soviet Union perspective over Berlin, both sides want peace. They want the same thing, but they want to signal to each other that the other side has to leave them alone. The Soviet Union wanted to signal to the United States that having West Berlin inside East Germany was completely unacceptable, whereas the United States wanted to signal to the Soviets that this was completely acceptable and the Soviets needed to stop the demand. So theoretically, when we think about this, in almost all aspects of international politics, states face this problem. They all want peace. That's not a question, right? If we just think about war as being a result of someone that just wants war, we have an easy explanation. But there's not that many people like that, as we talked about. There's not that many psychopaths, there's not that many sociopaths, and there's not that many of either group that just love violence and just want to engage in violence. Think about individuals, leaders, as people that want to avoid conflict, and yet they get there anyway. They all want to avoid conflict. Both leaders that are involved in a dispute want to avoid conflict. Everybody wants the same thing. What they disagree on is what peace looks like. And so if we think about that theoretically, what they disagree on is both sides benefit from cooperation. What they disagree on is how to split the gains from cooperation. And this is done in an environment of secrecy, right? Both sides are going to misrepresent. Much like I misrepresent to the car dealer, much like the dealer misrepresents to me, both sides are going to try to lie and try to misrepresent how powerful they are and how willing they are to go to war in order to get a better deal, right? So if we think about this and what this means, states may enter into war as a result of bargaining failure. Most of the time, states are negotiating over something and they fail to get a deal and they don't reach an agreement, they don't fight. Deals fail all the time in international politics, and countries don't fight each other all that much. But there may be some issues that are out there that are empirically salient, that are important to different states, and over those issues, you may see violence. Right. So if we think about some issues related to territory, some issues related to terrorism, on those issues, we may see violence. For example, if you think about the dyad of India and Pakistan, both sides have been willing to fight each other over control of the province of Kashmir. Now, why is that? One, there's ethnic ties to Kashmir, but also strategically, Kashmir is in a very important location. It's in a location where it's responsible for a bulk of Pakistan's water supply, and it's at the roof of the world, right? So strategically, if these two parties are rivals, they're going to want the high ground. Right, so over those salient type of issues, you may see states enter into war because they are so important, right? And in those cases, war becomes what we call an outside option if bargaining fails. An outside option is a choice that one or both parties will exercise if a negotiation fails, right? So the idea of an outside option is I can tell the dealer, if you don't give me the deal I want, I'll walk out and get the deal somewhere else. Or if we want to think about it as war, I can tell the dealer, give me the deal that I want, or I will impose physical harm on you and I will just take the car, right? So those are all forms of outside options. So to give you an empirical example, let's look at the dispute that NATO had with Yugoslavia over the province of Kosovo in the late 1990s. So in 1998, NATO collectively demanded that Yugoslavia stop its repressive campaign in the province of Kosovo. Kosovo was looked at as an integral part of Yugoslavia, but it was populated by a majority Muslim population, and the country of Yugoslavia at this point was led by Slobodan Milosevic, who was never a big fan of the Muslim population, wanted to, in a sense, push out the Muslims from Kosovo and try to repopulate it with Serbs. So at first, when NATO made this demand, it did not look like NATO was going to really do anything about it. It looked like NATO was just making demand publicly to try to encourage Slobodan Milosevic to stop his campaign, but it didn't look like there was going to be any consequence for it. So Milosevic refused to comply and stated that the campaign was essential for Yugoslavian security. Now, this changes the next year, in 1999. NATO again demanded that Yugoslavia cease its campaign against Muslims in Kosovo, and if Milosevic did not comply, NATO threatened that it would be willing to use military force and attack Yugoslavia. So this changes the calculus. Previously, if Milosevic just refused NATO's demands, nothing happens at all. But now, if Milosevic refuses NATO's demands, there's a chance that NATO might exercise violence against Yugoslavia. So this now changes Milosevic's calculus because refusal might be costly, but it will only be costly if NATO actually follows through. It will only be costly, if we want to go back to our example, if NATO gets up and goes to another dealer. Now again, think about this in terms of the bargaining problem. Both NATO and Milosevic in Yugoslavia want peace, right? Neither one wants to fight each other, but they disagree on what the terms of peace look like. NATO wants Milosevic to completely abandon his campaign in Kosovo. Milosevic believes that Kosovo is a sovereign territory. He can do whatever he wants. There's a disagreement on what cooperation looks like, right? Both sides want peace, though, but they disagree on what the terms of peace look like. So let's think about war in that way as an inefficient outcome. NATO threatened to make war against Milosevic in order to compel Milosevic to agree to terms, compel Milosevic to stop his campaign in Kosovo. Right, so threatening war is something that can be done to improve one state's bargaining position or a set of states' bargaining position. NATO got nothing out of Milosevic when it didn't threaten war. By threatening war, Milosevic might come to the table. The problem is actually going through with war is typically not the best outcome. It's much better to threaten war and have your adversary to give you things in negotiation than to actually go through with fighting. Now, why is that? Well, there's two reasons identified by Furon. The first is that war is risky, right? Actually going through with the promise to go to war might end up accomplishing your aims, but it might go very badly. So, for example, the Carter administration in the late 1970s threatened to attack Iran if Iran did not release hostages that were taken in the takeover of the U.S. embassy. In the effort to try to free those hostages, things went poorly. Right, the operation didn't go well, and the U.S. suffered a public humiliation. So war can go poorly if you actually choose to initiate it. The other problem with war is that war is costly, right? At a minimum, when a country initiates war, it's going to lose some of their arsenal. So you lose something. At a maximum, though, you start to lose soldiers and you're guaranteed to lose resources, and the war may go on a whole lot longer than you thought. I don't think there's any question that when the United States initiated war in 2003, it did not expect that the war was going to go on for over 10 years and that the war was going to cost tens of thousands of or it was going to cost thousands of American lives, not to mention tens of thousands of Iraqi lives. I don't think that was the belief, right? But that's the nature of war. There's an old saying that war is hell, and once you release the dogs of war, you don't know where they go. What that means is that war is a risk that you're taking, and it's costly. You're guaranteed to pay something. You don't know how much, but to be sure, you don't know how a war is going to end. So it's a nasty thing to initiate. But saying that you're going to initiate that nasty thing can hopefully convince your adversary to give in terms of negotiation and give you more in terms of bargaining so you don't have to go through with war. You want to be able to threaten war to improve your bargaining position, but going through with it is not going to necessarily be the best of outcomes. And that's the proof that Fearon was trying to get at in the reading. Now, I don't want to go over all the proof, but the idea of Fearon was that if you have an issue that is continuous, meaning it's an issue that's divisible, and you had rational states, and we assume that war is going to be risky, you win it with probability P and lose it with probability 1 minus P, and we assume that it's costly, then there is some division of the good that both sides should prefer to war, right? If that's true, both sides in complete information, right? If they had complete information about each other's power and resolve, should agree to a settlement that's just as good as what they would get out of war. Now let's think about what that means. Let's think about the decision of the United States to enter into the war in Iraq in 2003. Right before the war starts, George Bush came and publicly announced that Saddam and his sons had 48 hours to leave Iraq, right? And if they left Iraq, the United States would not attack Iraq, right? You would achieve peace. But the fundamental demand was that Saddam and his sons had to leave Iraq. Now think about that. What if they took that offer? Would you prefer that offer, right? What if it were the case that Saddam and his sons just left, right, in that period? Think about that. Thousands of American lives would have been spared. Tens of thousands of Iraqi lives would have been spared. Trillions of dollars would have been saved. Untold amounts of damage would have been spared of Iraq. And we would not still be in a situation where Iraq is not stable, right? Iraq right now is not stable. Coronavirus has really made Iraq unstable, right? That instability may have been there without the war, but it's certainly been exacerbated by the war, right? And the political situation in Iraq is much more perilous than it ever was in this period prior to the initiation of conflict, right? It's much more uncertain. When I say perilous in that case, I mean more uncertain. So given that, would the United States and Iraq have both been better off if Saddam Hussein and his sons just left Iraq in that 48 hours? If you answer yes, what you're saying is that there is some settlement that is preferable to war, both for the United States and for Iraq. But it didn't happen in that case. right? So let's think about that and think about the cost of war and what happened as a result. From the coalition standpoint, again, the war cost 4,000 battle deaths. There's been over $1 trillion spent in military operations and healthcare since the war, and we don't know how many more are going to come. From the Iraqi perspective, they lost over 100,000 people, and that number continues to rise because ISIS is suppressed in Iraq, but there's still violence in Iraq. So, in a sense, the consequence of the war continues to go on, and the country was utterly destroyed. So, if you think about all of that, would you prefer the current outcome, or would you prefer the outcome where Saddam Hussein and his sons just left and you were spared the war? And if you answer the latter, you see that there is some deal that was preferable to war. We just didn't get there. So why is that? Well, the idea again is that countries may be better off making that deal and avoiding war. But in order to try to improve their terms in negotiation, they may want to threaten war even though they don't want to go through with it. If we go back to our auto dealer example, the auto dealer, the dealer is not going to give me anything if I don't threaten something, right? So if I don't threaten to walk out, I won't get a good deal. If I don't threaten my outside option, I won't get a good deal. I just won't. I'll get a deal that's unsatisfactory, right? And if we think about this in international politics, when NATO did not threaten Yugoslavia, it didn't get anything. When it does threaten Yugoslavia, that's when it has an opportunity to try to get something out of this. If we look at the example here with Kennedy and Khrushchev in the Cuban Missile Crisis, had Kennedy not threatened to invade Cuba, the missiles would still be there, right? There's no reason for the Soviets to actually change anything, right? It's the threat of war that compels them ultimately to redeploy those missiles. And the threat of war that ultimately produces a deal where Khrushchev redeploys the missiles and the Jupiter missiles are taken out of Turkey and the United States promises not to invade Cuba. Now, in that case, both sides knew that conflict was terribly costly and terribly risky. No, none of us would probably be here had war been initiated, but they had to threaten in order to get something out of this deal. If that's the case, both sides should prefer to avoid war. If both sides understand that war is costly and risky, both sides should prefer some deal short of war that would avoid war but accomplish what they both want, which is the achievement of peace. Now, according to Fearon, if both sides have complete and perfect information, they should be able to identify a deal short of war that they prefer. And we should not see war at all if both sides have complete and perfect information. The problem is we often don't have complete and perfect information. Remember that the international system is often very noisy and it's information poor. How many of you, for example, know just how powerful North Korea is? We don't. We know they're pretty powerful. We know they look like they have nuclear weapons technology. Do you know if they have the technology to hit the United States? They tell you that they do, but do they really? The problem is they lie, right? And we don't have complete information about what their capabilities actually are. This is the heart of the problem. The United States know for sure that Saddam did not have weapons of mass destruction. Everybody thought he did, right? Turns out he did not. Again, it's information poor. How far along is Iran today? We don't know, right? We have an idea of how far they are in terms of developing nuclear weapons, but we don't know that for sure. The problem here, again, is that parties have incentives to keep information about power and resolve private. If Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons technology, you can be sure they're not going to tell you that. You can be sure they're going to tell you the opposite, that they do have this capability, right? On the flip side, Saudi Arabia looks like they probably have this weapons technology, but have incentives to keep it quiet. Because if they have that technology, it opens the door for Iran to accelerate its weapons program, right? Let's think about another dispute. Think about the US, China, and Taiwan. The United States does not tell everyone that if China were to attack Taiwan, it would defend Taiwan. The reason for that is if they did tell everyone they would defend Taiwan, there's a possibility Taiwan might declare independence. So there has to be some ambiguity there. But there also has to be some signal to the Chinese that there's a possibility the United States will intervene to defend Taiwan. Again, what we see is that there is a mixed signaling going on here. There's a noisy environment. It's not clear exactly what everyone's going to do. It's not clear what everyone's power is in the case of North Korea. It's not clear what everyone's resolve is in the case of the US and Taiwan and China. What that means is that every side has incentive to try to use uncertainty to try to improve their terms. The dealer doesn't know exactly what I'm willing to pay for a car, so I have incentives to lie. The dealer doesn't know if I'm actually willing to walk out or not, so I have incentives to lie. The United States does not know if North Korea can actually hit it with nuclear weapons, so North Korea has incentives to lie. The United States doesn't know about Iran's capability, Iran has incentive to lie. And none of these sides, North Korea or Iran, know if the United States is really willing to use force against them, or if the United States is not willing to use force against them. So the United States has an incentive to lie. Again, in all these situations, we're in an international system where it's noisy, it's unclear, it's uncertain. And given that uncertainty, everyone has incentives to misrepresent both their power, their capabilities, and their assets, and their resolve, which is their willingness to use force. And so, if that's the case, if we're in a situation where everyone is misrepresenting their true capability and their resolve, war might be a product of information failure. Both sides are trying to get a better deal by overstating their military capabilities and their willingness to fight. If that continues, there's one possibility where both sides just fail to reach a settlement. But if it seems like the other side is going to attack, if it seems like there is no alternative but to attack, there is an advantage to going first. In any military situation, you would want to control or dictate events. You would want to react to events. If that's the case, there's a first strike advantage. So if I'm negotiating and it seems like my adversary is not responding, and it seems like my adversary is not willing to listen, and it seems like I'm not going to get a deal, or I'm going to have to sacrifice too much, my incentive is to strike first. And if that's the case, given that there's an advantage to striking first, that's when we may see a war start. Now, if you follow this through, this isn't unlike a lot of traditional explanations for why war occurs. War occurs because the sides couldn't read each other. War occurs because one side thought that there was no point in bargaining anymore. Both sides get into war because both sides didn't understand each other's capabilities. They thought one side had weapons of mass destruction in the case of Iraq, and they didn't. Those are stories that you've heard before. The difference in the Fearon explanation is that this is done with a mathematical proof. So it identifies these are the assumptions we make about states, these are the assumptions we make about bargaining. Given those assumptions, these are logically how we get to this issue where we get war, which is it's a product of information failure, and it's logically consistent. So let's think about some empirical examples of this to clarify it, right? So let's look at the first example of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The crisis begins on October 16, 1962, when the U.S. discovered missile sites in Cuba, right? So these operational nuclear weapons in Cuba, as we've talked about, would offset the U.S. first strike advantage. The status quo was that the U.S. had missiles in place that could hit the Soviet Union if the Soviet Union decided to invade Western Europe. That was supposed to produce deterrence. Nobody wanted to use that. Nobody wanted to actually engage in nuclear war. The Soviets didn't want that. The US didn't want that. And right now, the status quo was that the US had the ability to make war to deter the Soviet Union. But if these missiles in Cuba became operational, suddenly the terms of peace would be revised in favor of the Soviet Union. Again, Cuba is 90 miles from the US, which is less than the distance from here to Charlotte. And so if those missiles became operational, they could hit the US really quickly, and the Soviets would have the first strike advantage, in addition to the military advantage in Europe. So this would be a move that would fundamentally revise the status quo in favor of the Soviets. So on October 22nd, 1962, right, Kennedy first tries to probe the Soviet Union to see, right prior to October 22, Kennedy tries to probe the Soviet Union to see, will they acknowledge that they actually are developing missiles in Cuba? The Soviets lie and say that they are not. Now, what that tells Kennedy is that if he were to just privately ask the Soviet Union to take those missiles out, their response was going to be just to deny it, right? They were not going to respond to just asking them. So he threatens them, right? On October 22, 1962, Kennedy publicly announces the blockade of Cuba and goes to DEFCON 3, which means he increases U.S. military readiness. Think about what he's doing here. In front of his public, he tells everybody that the Soviets are building missiles, right? So he basically tells the American public that there may be this possibility of war. He tells the American public that if the status quo stands, it will be unacceptable, right? That there will be missiles in Cuba, which is not something the U.S. is willing to tolerate. And he publicly threatens the Soviet Union and says that if they don't change their behavior, if they don't remove the missiles, he will exercise his outside option and go to war. The idea being If he's able to threaten the Soviet Union and say that this might lead to nuclear war, the Soviet Union will dismantle the missiles. If he doesn't threaten war, there's no way the Soviets dismantle the missiles. It's that threat of force that's intended to compel them to pull the missiles out. But certainly, Kennedy did not want to go through with that threat. You're just using threat to gain bargaining leverage with the hope that you don't have to go through it. But you have to use that threat if you want to have any bargaining leverage, right? That was the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So on October 24th, 1962, what you saw were some results. Famously, Soviet ships heading for Cuba turned back. But what he sees is that missile construction on the island of Cuba continues to intensify. So the U.S. ups its readiness. It moves to DEFCON 2, which is one state away from nuclear war. And the U.S. begins mobilizing its units for an attack on Cuba, right? And that was coming. Secretly, as this is happening, the missile sites in Cuba become operational, and the Soviet commanders on the ground are given the go-ahead to use the missiles if they are attacked. Now think about that. This is where we would get a mistake, right? The U.S. argument for invading Cuba at that point would be to stop those missiles from becoming operational. But the missiles became operational, right? Things had already changed, which meant that had something gone wrong, we are in nuclear war, right? We're in a war that nobody wants. Everyone was trying to avoid, but we get there as a result of a mistake. And later, in interviews, when Robert McNamara was Secretary of Defense at the time, visited Cuba to try to talk about this years after the fact, Castro basically told him, I was advocating using nuclear weapons. And McNamara told Castro, Mr. President, do you know we were this close to nuclear war? And Castro says, we weren't that close to nuclear war. We were this close to nuclear war, right? It was that close, right? It was going to come, and this could have come as a result of a mistake, right? This could have come as a result of miscommunication and a fear of striking first, right? Here you see that the Kennedy administration wanted to strike first to try to get rid of the missiles, but had they done that, we're in nuclear war. So on October 28th, 1962, the way the story ends is that Khrushchev announces that missile construction on Cuba will cease. Now, the reason he did that is because a deal was cut where the Soviets would stop building their weapons on Cuba and redeploy them, and the U.S. would remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey, which it was planning on doing anyway. Now, again, notice what happened. Both sides were using bluff. Both sides were trying to signal to each other that they were willing to go to nuclear war. Both sides tried to send signals about their willingness to go to nuclear war, but it was very clear that neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev actually wanted to go through with nuclear war. Thankfully, we didn't get to that point. Thankfully, these threats actually ended in a peaceful settlement. But again, it was that close, right? It was really, really close. And it's worth actually reading Khrushchev's quote in one of the messages he sent to Kennedy. He sent multiple messages to Kennedy, but this one looked like it was actually coming from Khrushchev himself. And if you read it, it's interesting. It says, we and you ought not to pull on the ends of a rope which you have tied the knot of war. Because the more the two of us pull, the tighter the knot will be tied. And then it will be necessary to cut that knot. And what that would mean is not for me to explain to you. I have participated in 2 wars and know that war ends when it is rolled through cities and villages, everywhere sowing death and destruction, for such is the logic of war. Think about that analogy. As the two negotiate, the knot of war is becoming increasingly tight. And there will be a point where the knot becomes irreversible and both sides would have to cut that knot, or one side would have to cut that knot. And that's the war, right? So the negotiation is tying the knot of war. It's slowly tying the knot of war. At some point, it could go too far. The hope is that as you start to tie the knot of war, the two sides realize their folly and stop, right? And we get a negotiated settlement that's preferable to the onset of war. So let's look at a case that didn't actually end up in war, which is the U.S. and Haiti. So again, and we'll look at 2 other ones just to illustrate this point. Right, so early 1990s, September 1991, Haitian leader Aristide, President Aristide is ousted from power by a military junta in Cuba. So initially, the United States condemned this and demanded that Aristide be returned to power. Nobody listened. The U.S. demanded again. Nobody listened, right? It was pretty clear that the United States didn't seem interested in doing a whole lot to actually force the junta to restore Aristide to power, so the junta did nothing. In 1993, the U.S. finally issued a threat that it was going to restore Aristide to power with force. Now, you can imagine if it took 2 years for the United States to actually threaten the junta in Haiti, they weren't taking this seriously, right? It didn't seem like the United States was really, really interested in fighting in Haiti, of all places, right, to try to restore President Aristide. That did not seem to be a key foreign policy priority of the United States, right? It seemed like the United States was more concerned with Iraq, which had just fought a war in. The United States had fought in Panama before that, right? The United States had concerns in Europe. The United States had many other concerns in the world. For the leaders of the junta, right, they probably thought, well, Haiti is not something that's really on the American public's radar. It's not something the presidents really care about. It's taken them years to actually make any signals. They're not actually going to fight. They're not actually going to invade Haiti. So in September 1994, the U.S. sent the delegation to Haiti, right? The delegation consisted of high-profile American officials, including Colin Powell, and the delegation informed the Haitian junta, we are serious, right? We will actually invade if you don't step down and restore Aristide to power, right? Soon after that, the U.S. began mobilizing an invasion force, right? Again, think about this from the junta's perspective. They're getting high-profile Americans coming to them and telling them the U.S. is serious. They can start to observe an invasion force being prepared, and then they can observe President Clinton's public signal that the U.S. is going to go to war. It's going to use military force if the talks fail. When they get that information, they can conclude, okay, we know the U.S. has power, right? We know the U.S. is more powerful than Haiti, so if they wanted to, they could force us out of power. What our issue has always been is that the U.S. doesn't have the resolve to do this. The U.S. is not really interested. But now the U.S. is sending high-profile Americans to us, preparing an invasion force, and Clinton is saying publicly that we're going to have to step down. Maybe they're serious. And so at that point, the Haitian military junta did agree to step down. And in this case, the U.S. threat to employ force produced peace on American terms. Aristide was restored back into power. So that's a case where the threat of war actually, again, worked successfully. The Cuban Missile Crisis, it worked successfully, though it was really dangerous. Here, it worked successfully. Less dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis, but dangerous nonetheless. Now, let's look at a case where this goes not so well. And this is the case of the United States and China in 1950 during the Korean War, right? So if you look at a map of the Koreas today, you'll notice that they're divided roughly at the 30th parallel, right, which is there. So there's two countries, North Korea and South Korea, right? Think about where that ends. And let's think about where we begin, right? After World War II, Korea was divided largely in that way. North Korea was created, which was going to consist of, which was going to be occupied by communists. South Korea consisted that was going to be occupied by U.S. forces, right? So Korea is divided after World War II. Now, on June 25th, 1950, right, North Korea attacked the South, believing they would be welcomed, right, as liberators. And this was in part because that the United States had said that its interest lied in Japan, right, not necessarily west of Japan, at Japan, right? That was the point where the U.S. was really interested in terms of establishing its defenses, right, in Asia. When the Soviets got that message, they had concluded that the United States was not really interested in protecting South Korea, and they gave the go-ahead, right? They said that, in a sense, the North Koreans could go ahead and adopt this operation with an expectation that the U.S. was not going to defend this territory, right? That was wrong, right? They believed that the U.S. did not have the resolve to defend South Korea. That turned out to be wrong, right? And then on June 27th, through the UN, there was an operation that was authorized to try to protect the territory of South Korea. But initially, that goes very badly. Initially, U.S. forces were being pushed way back in South Korea to what was called the Pusan perimeter. So think about what's going on here. It looked like the U.S. didn't have the resolve to defend South Korea. It turned out that they did. But now it looks like the U.S. doesn't have the capability to defend South Korea, right? Because the North Korean military is achieving success over the U.S. military and its South Korean allies, and basically pushing them to the point where they are almost completely pushed off the peninsula. So now there's updating, right? North Koreans learned that the U.S. doesn't have a whole lot of capability there and continues to push onward. Now that turned out to be wrong, right? Because at the Pusan perimeter, there was a famous landing at Incheon, right? Douglas MacArthur, hero of World War II, initiated a landing at Incheon, which cut the North Korean supply line and sent them running, right? So at that point, it did look like the U.S. had the capability to continue to win this war. The North Koreans were broken. They were sent running back to this point right here, basically to the Yalu River, which bordered China, right? And as the U.S. made a decision, because things were going so well, to pursue them, and the United States and South Korea took control of almost the entire country at this point. The U.S. and UN forces continued their advance to the North Korean border. Now, once they got there, North Korean attacks continued from Chinese territory. At that point, Douglas MacArthur asked for a lifting of restrictions against bombing raids into China. He asked to basically attack China, with the argument being that China is assisting the North Koreans in fighting the United States right here. Right? And MacArthur's argument is also North China has been a target of the United States, deposing Mao Zedong as an initiative of the United States. Let's do it now while the United States actually has assets here to do it with, right? And he starts making these public statements that China will face extinction, right, if they continue to support the North Korean forces, right, and that the United States may be willing to use nuclear weapons against China if need be to prosecute this conflict. So China warns at this point that it would not allow for the destruction and dismantlement of North Korea. It basically signals to the United States that that will not be acceptable, that the United States continues to operate and continues to occupy North Korea. MacArthur thinks that the Chinese are bluffing, right? He just thinks that the Chinese are not telling the truth. And he confidently dismisses them and claims that U.S. forces will be home by Christmas. That's his famous statement. His argument is that Mao Zedong has always talked big, right? The Chinese communists have always talked big and they never follow through. They always promise to liberate Taiwan. They don't do it, right? They always make big promises, but they don't have the capability and they don't have the resolve. So he thinks that they're just lying. And he assures President Truman at the time that China does not have the capability to intervene. Even if they want to, they don't have the capability. That was his assurance to Truman. Again, turns out to be wrong. Because as MacArthur is talking, under the cover of night, the Chinese are mobilizing by the Yalu River. And on November 25th or 26th, China engages in a massive offensive. Now, they were technologically less equipped than the American forces, but they had numerous people, right? And they engaged in what was called human wave attacks, where it was just they sent people and sent people and sent people. And with enough people, they eventually overwhelmed the American defenses, and the United States was sent pushing back, right, past the 30th parallel and past Seoul. At that point, the Chinese were able to capture the bulk of North Korea and pushed back into Seoul and pushed back into South Korean territory. MacArthur was dismissed, and the U.S. forces seem to be in disarray. So if you're the Chinese right now, right, the U.S. misread you, right? The U.S. misread Chinese resolve and misread Chinese power. And now by observing that the Americans are again in disarray, the Chinese misread the United States, right? The Chinese think, okay, the U.S. is actually weaker than we thought, right? They looked a lot stronger when they were occupying North Korea. They're actually weaker than we thought. That turned out to be wrong too, right? By the time we get to January 1951, from January to April of 1951, the United States began a counteroffensive. This became known as the meat grinder. You can imagine what that meant, right? As the U.S. learned how to start to repel some of these human wave attacks, right? The meat grinder gradually moves north and reestablishes an armistice line here, which took back Seoul and took back Panmunjom, right? So it took back a lot of the area that were lost. Eisenhower indicated at this point that he wanted to end the war. So the U.S. and the UN reclaimed much of the territory that was lost and moved the border to its current state. So it looks like at this point, China overplayed its hand. And at that point, we get an armistice. So let's think about all that has happened here, right? War has happened. War was threatened by the United States. War was threatened by the North, right? Threatened by North Korea and the Soviet Union. Wasn't taken seriously. There was an initiation. The United States indicated it wasn't interested in protecting South Korea. That enabled that war. That turned out to be wrong. The United States then announced that it was going to occupy North Korea and threaten China and claimed that China was not going to intervene. That turns out to be wrong. China thinks that the United States is a paper tiger. That turns out to be wrong. There are lots of different misperceptions that come from this really noisy environment, right? And what they're observing in terms of capability and resolve. And if we think about the inefficiency of war here, let's look at it, right? The war ends in basically roughly the same spot that it began. North Korea looks pretty much the same. South Korea looks pretty much the same. And if we think about the inefficiency here, there were 468,052 Allied deaths, most of those South Koreans. An untold number of communist deaths took place. We're estimating about 2 million, but it could very well be more. Many of those were Chinese, right? The Chinese military capability was reduced to something like 20%, right? The PLA got clobbered here, right? The People's Liberation Army of China. And yet, with all of that loss and all of that destruction, the border has moved right back to where it was. That is the inefficiency of war in a nutshell. If all sides had known that the war over this period of time was going to end in exactly the same spot that it began, I think it's reasonable to believe that all sides would have chosen to avoid it. All sides just wouldn't have initiated this conflict in the first place. That's bargaining failure, right? This same deal would have been acceptable to all sides at the beginning. The problem is they misread each other's resolve and misread each other's power, and they ended up in war. And if we look at where it ends up, it's in exactly the same place. Now think about some of the wars that you might remember, right? Think about the Iraq War. Is that inefficient, right? Are we at a place in the Iraq War where you would have taken that at the beginning, right? You would have left Saddam Hussein alone if you knew how this was going to turn out. And I don't have an answer to that, right? That really is for all of you to decide, right? You can think about the Afghan war. Would you have left the Taliban alone if you knew that this is where we are, right? That 18 years later, you're still in Afghanistan fighting this war. Would you have just left that alone, right? Are there cases where you think it's useful to threaten war given that there's a possibility you could end up in this, right? Is it useful to threaten Iran given there's a possibility of ending up in war, which would be a very difficult conflict? Again, I think that's something for all of you to think about and decide. The point of this is think about why states are willing to threaten war, even though it's clearly inefficient and costly. That provides bargaining power. That allows you to achieve successes like the Cuban Missile Crisis in Haiti. But if you're going to threaten a war, sometimes you're going to end up with this, which is the Korean conflict, which is an inefficiency, right? Where you lose tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people, sometimes for very little, right? That's the inefficiency of war. So again, think about the argument that's being made. If we boil this down to the theoretical mechanism, states to improve their bargaining position may sometimes threaten to use force, and that's a calculated risk. And they can bluff about their true power, they can bluff about their resolve, they can bluff about their intentions in order to improve their position. All states want the same thing. All states want peace. If they want peace that's improving their terms, right? Say we have countries that are arguing over territory like Kashmir. I prefer peace, but I want all of Kashmir, right? If I'm Indian, I prefer peace. If I'm Pakistan, but I want all of it. To get all of it, I might threaten to use force. I might take that gamble to compel my adversary to give it to me. I might say I'm a lot more powerful than I am. I might say I'm a lot more resolved to fight than I am. I might say that I have a lot more intention to do this than I actually do. And that private information can actually end up sometimes leading to war because that poses a threat. And when that threat is created, there's an incentive to strike first. So sometimes these efforts to revise the status quo in this way may end in bargaining failure, which end in war. And that is the tragedy, right? That's the tragedy of war. So two things to think about with this explanation. First, is it actually falsifiable? Can we show that it's wrong? For any good theory, what you want to be able to do is to demonstrate that it can be right and demonstrate that it can be wrong. If you can never be wrong, then we don't know if you're ever right. The problem with it is that empirically uncertainty is ubiquitous in international relations. And if we say uncertainty is the cause of international relations, well, it's always there. So in a sense, we can't identify, is it actually causing anything? We can only identify this effect theoretically, but not empirically, right? So the alternative is to try to think about factors that might reduce uncertainty, which by extension may reduce the probability of war. So what we're going to think about when we examine immediate deterrence is we're going to imagine crises and think about what factors might there be in crises that might allow states to communicate with each other better so they can minimize some of these issues associated with uncertainty in information and therefore avoid conflict. So that's what we're going to do in the next part of today's talk. So I'll go ahead and stop there and we'll start the next segment.